Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second week of the online Society of Army Historical Research Centennial Conference events. Those that were with us last week will be aware of the process, but I'm conscious that there are a number of people here this evening who are attending a Centennial Conference session for the first time. They say that no plan survives contact with the enemy, and that was certainly true of the Society's Centennial Conference, which was due to take place over 2 days at the National Army Museum. But as soon as it became obvious to the organising committee that this was not going to be possible, we quickly reverted to Plan B and devised a plan to bring the whole conference, or as much of it as we could rescue, online. And to that, an extraordinary amount of effort has been put in by the subcommittee whose work needs to be recognised tonight. That's your chairman, Ewan Carmichael, Andrew Banford, Andrew Cormack, Eamon O'Keefe, Charles Street, and Carol Dixon-Smith. Now, for those that are, once again, unfamiliar with the platform we're using this evening, it's a system called Demio, and it works through your browser. Many of you will be familiar with Zoom. Zoom is a perfectly acceptable platform, but it takes an awful lot to make certain that everyone's cameras are off and everyone's mic is muted. Demio works through your browser and therefore relies entirely on the connection at your end. If you have poor internet connection, there are 2 or 3 fixes that I can suggest to you to solve any problems that you might be having with your audio or with your video. The first immediate action drill, as we would call it in the Army, is to refresh your browser. And for those that don't know how to do that, that small circle to the top left of your browser window, which is almost completed with an arrow, that's the refresh button. Click on that, it will refresh the page. If that IA drill does not work, then try using the IT crowd solution, which is to close the tab and then come back in again using the same link. If that doesn't work and you are able to do so, the third IA drill would be to use a different browser. So Demio supports Chrome, Safari, Microsoft Edge, and Firefox. And if you've got more than one of those browsers, you might be able to use an alternative. I apologize, but on the rare occasions where those IAs don't work, then there is sadly not much that I can do for you. But you are all guaranteed a copy of the recording, which will be sent automatically to you at the end of this evening's session and will be in your inboxes by no later than tomorrow morning. We have nearly 100 people who have signed up for the panel this evening from literally all over the world, from the United States, from Canada, from Australia, and from Netherlands, as well as France, Portugal, and Bermuda. So, as I said, this is the second week of a 6-week program. We start each Wednesday evening with a keynote address, which is a pre-recorded video. And then we go into a panel discussion where we've got 2 or 3 20-minute papers delivered by members of the Society, and also people who are not members of the Society, but whose papers have been accepted for the Centennial Conference. I'm now going to hand over proceedings to the chairman of the evening, and that's Phil McCarthy. And I will be monitoring in the background and trying to sort out any problems that you might be having with your connections. So Phil, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dudley. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Phil McCarthy, and I am sort of dual-hatted in these proceedings because I'm a member of council of the SAHR, where I'm the council member responsible for the coordination of the student essay prize competition that we run every year. And I'm also a member of the members advisory group at the National Army Museum. And I would only say, if you're not a member of either, why not join one or even both? They are both very worthwhile organisations to be members of, as I hope tonight will show. This evening, it is the Second World War themed evening, and we have two presentations, both given by historian practitioners. So Gareth and Philip, if I could ask you briefly to turn your cameras on to say good evening to the assembled crowd.
Evening. I can't see myself yet. There we are. Boom. Up we come.
Oh, no sign of Philip. Ah, there we are. Good evening. So, ladies and gentlemen, here are your speakers. So you'll be seeing Philip later. If I could ask him kindly to turn off his camera, and I will introduce Gareth. Gareth describes himself as a warfare analyst and military historian, long-serving army officer in tanks, armour, staff duties, considerable active service, and also at the Land Warfare School, ending up with a master's degree in defence studies from King's College London, which I'm sure quite a few of us are from here tonight ourselves as well. Gareth is going to give us a presentation on, was the infantry tank concept valid in the context, I beg your pardon, of the Second World War. So at this point, I will shut up and invite Gareth to turn on his slides and speak to us. Over to you, Gareth.
Phil, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to the Society for inviting me to present this paper this evening, and thank you to all those who have tuned in to hear me try and answer the question, was the concept of the infantry tank valid in the context of the Second World War? Perhaps I should have chosen a slightly easier question to answer with concept and context in there. I want to say, yeah, thank you to those who tuned in, including a few chums that I have managed to persuade to come and listen. This question is something I looked at a while ago, and it came out of some work I was doing on the development of combined arms warfare in the early 30s and in the 1930s and 1940s. And it is a bit combined armsy, but I'm going to be focusing, perhaps ironically, because most of my work is combined arms, on just one aspect of it, the infantry tank. And it's probably worth just doing a little bit of history before I get in to answer the question about what do I think a tank is. And this isn't meant to patronize any of our audience, it's to explain where I'm coming from. And on the left-hand side, top left, it's I can't see, it's a Mark IV. In 1617 and 18, a tank was a heavy infantry support weapon, which then in 1918 was joined bottom left there by its faster, lighter cousin that could be used for exploitation. So top left, infantry support, assault. Bottom left, exploitation. Fast forward 20 years, to 1939, and the British Army had a tank fleet which, at its core, had the same roles, the same tasks. Infantry support using infantry tanks, and shown top right, well, the two there, the Matilda 1 and Matilda 2, and, well, the exploitation and perhaps a bit of deep strike as well, using cruiser tanks. And I've got 3 cruiser tanks shown below, and somebody will probably ask me what those 3 tanks are. They're cruisers, and that's all we need to know. The journey to this point, 1939, was slow. It was painful. It was underfunded. It suffered from misplaced evangelism, bordering on fanaticism by men who wore the Blackberry I wore and the cap badge I wore, men from the Royal Tank Corps. And in a number of cases, Tank Corps men got it wrong, in my humble opinion. It's a fascinating story, and I think it's a story that people need to go and look at, people who are in the development of the army area, because I think there are many parallels between what was going on then and what's going on now. But I've only got 20 minutes to talk. Well, I've got about 17 and a half minutes to talk now. So I'm going to have to leap over all of that. And I'm going to start in essentially September 1939, the formation of the Royal Armoured Corps. And at that point, the Royal Armoured Corps had 2 armoured divisions, going up to 3 by the end of 1940, one of which was in Egypt. Now, armoured divisions have about 200 cruiser tanks. There's some light tanks as well, but I'm parking light tanks completely for this presentation. So we've got 200 cruiser tanks per division, so about 400 to start with, gusting up to 600 within a year. And we had a thing called an army tank brigade. We had one in the regular army and one in the first line territorial army. And they were equipped with 150 infantry tanks. The roles were very different. Armoured divs, using those 3 sets of cruisers you see at the bottom of the slide, were, according to people like Hobart, a strategic deep strike formation. Whereas tank brigades would send their tank battalions off to support infantry divisions. And they would then go toe-to-toe with an enemy in a defensive position. And as a result of these different roles, clearly they got different tanks, different tactics, and actually there's some differing views on how they should be used. In simple terms, and again, I apologise if people find I'm patronising, I'm not meaning to, infantry tanks at the top, they're well protected. As a result, they're slow. But they don't need to be quick. They're there to go along with the infantry, just as the Mark IV was on the top left there. Cruisers, less well protected, faster, can do that, getting into the rear areas, causing havoc, that sort of cavalry strike type role. Interestingly, not Matilda 1, but the Matilda 2 on the right and the cruiser at the bottom, they've all got the same 2-pounder gun, which is probably a bad thing. And I'm not really going to dwell on that, but there's an interesting side story there. So having set the scene very, very briefly, what I'm now going to do is look at 5 vignettes, which I've carefully picked or cherry-picked, depending on your view, which I think, brought together, will answer the question about whether the concept of an infantry tank was valid in the context of the Second World War. And my first vignette is the Arras counterattack. And what we've got there at the top is a map. Red is the British. In the good old days, we were in red. Green is French forces, and the blue are German forces. I'm not going to go through the map because I think most of you will know the overall situation. At the bottom, we've got some Matilda 1s from the 4th Royal Tank Regiment a few days before they go into battle, maybe a couple of weeks. On the 20th of May, the 1st Army Tank Brigade just had 2 of its battalions in France, the 4th and the 7th Royal Tank Regiments. And the 4th had Matilda 1s, as shown there. The 7th had a mix of 1s and 2s. And on the 20th, they moved to the Vimy Ridge area in support of the 50th Northumbria Division, which is actually quite useful because the GOC of 50th was a guy called Martel. Martel had been a captain in Tank Corps headquarters in the First World War. He understood armour. He understood combined arms. He understood what you could do with a tank and what you couldn't do with a tank. And so between the brigade commander, who did some reorganisation, shuffling around so the Mark 1s and Mark 2s were spread evenly, and the divisional commander, who organised the 2 tank battalions, a couple of infantry battalions, some artillery, including anti-tank artillery and field artillery, into 2 battle groups, for want of a better term, and they led an attack against Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. The attack, as shown in the red, was this wide counterclockwise circuit around Arras, and a small force, Martel actually describes it as pitiful, a force that loses both commanding officers of 4 and 7 RTR killed fairly early on. They were in light tanks. There's a lesson there, in my humble opinion: fight light, die early. The operation was a success. It delayed Rommel's advance. It also destroyed quite a bit of Rommel's material, equipment. And I would argue Matildas, particularly the Mark II, had shown their value. They had been able to move with the infantry. They'd had the right levels of operational, they'd had to come a bit of a distance, and tactical mobility. And they had at times gone toe-to-toe with panzers. Yes, I know the bulk of the force was Panzer 1s and 2s, maybe a few 3s in there. So it wasn't the hardest force that anybody ever fought, but they had survived it. And more importantly, they proved their worth. Brigadier Pope, who was head of the AFE branch at GHQ, he noted that, yes, they needed a better gun. He slightly hedged his bets. He said that the 2-pounder was just about good enough at the moment. I think he was wrong because he didn't have an HE shell. He said they needed thicker armour. But he then went on to say that the 1st Army Tank Brigade had walked through everything it had met. It was mechanical failures that wrecked it. I fear that cruisers, lighter, faster tanks would have been too thin-skinned. And I'm absolutely certain that Pope was correct in that assessment. So, stand fast 1 or 2 Matildas that had been hit by 88s, but we didn't know it at the time. I would argue the concept of the infantry tank at Arras was entirely valid. It traded punches, it had withstood, as I say, stand fast the 88s, German anti-tank gunfire, and had not suffered because of any mobility issues. So that's my first vignette. Let's move on, and still in 1940, and still with the 7th Royal Tank Regiment, but now in Egypt. And they have been out in Egypt from about September, and they're about to go into action in December 1940 in support of the 4th Indian Division. And the plan was shown on the top map. There's a shaded area just sort of across to the west of the map. That's where 7th Armoured Division, equipped with cruisers, would form a blocking position so that the Italians couldn't reinforce. And the 7 RTR was going to attack the Italian camps and forts close to Sidi Barrani. A relatively straightforward plan at the higher level. Initial phase was a success. Italians caught by surprise, and the mass of 2 squadrons of Matildas quickly overwhelmed the defenders. 7 RTR able to engage the Italian tanks with no difficulty, but the Italian guns couldn't penetrate the Matildas, and quite a lot of demoralization of the Italians on top. There was some damage to British tanks by mines, but that was about it. Second phase, they had to move about 5 miles further north. There was a bit of difficulty finding the objective due to a sandstorm. They got a bit lost. They were about 2 hours late launching, but that also was a success. And by the end of the day, they'd carried out a number of attacks against battalion-sized objectives. All the tanks bore the scars of both artillery and tank fire, but none had been penetrated. And so, again, I would argue that what these Matildas had done, going toe-to-toe with an enemy, in close support of infantry, and with the close support of that infantry, they had succeeded in a way that I'm pretty sure cruisers wouldn't. Cruisers may have relied on their higher speed to dodge the Italian fire. But I would argue that would have caused additional problems by making the gap between the tanks and their supporting infantry even greater. So, so far, 2 out of 2. Staying in North Africa for my third vignette, and this is Operation Battle Axe in 1941. But I am actually going to throw in a little bit of failure here. The plan, again, was to use a mix of cruisers and infantry tanks. The Matildas are on the inside of the wheel, and to assault their area around Hellfire Pass, and then on to Brazier, whilst the faster-moving 7th Armoured Division would swing wider and attack at those lighter targets in depth. Again, sound plan, but 4 RTR who were in this attack, their artillery was late arriving. It got stuck in the sand, in simple terms. And so 4 RTR went into action without significant artillery support and without infantry support. Tanks with no infantry support and no artillery were caught in the open, and they were caught in the open by 88s. 88s that they had not come up, well, they had at Arras, but they didn't know they had come up against. And this was a shock. And they suffered. They suffered significantly. But I would argue, although I'm now giving you an example of a failure, this was a failure of tactics, a failure of the plan, not the failure of infantry tanks. And I would, again, suggest that had cruisers been involved, yes, they have a higher speed and they might therefore have been less vulnerable to the 88 fire. They would not have succeeded. So we're 2 out of the 5 in. I'm going to press on, and I would argue at this stage, by about 1942, yeah, the concept, 3 in, concept is valid, but people are starting to ask questions about the policy. And there are a number of reasons put forward about why it's the wrong policy. The first was the training required. It's very different, both technically, the tanks are different, but there's also the tactical aspect. And with the tactical aspect, there's a mindset. Infantry tanks are crewed by the RTR. Cruisers, yes, there are some tankies equipping them, but there's also the cavalry. And so there is a slightly different mindset. And that requires perhaps bespoke training. And at war, we haven't got that that luxury. Second, of course, is the equipment. We've got different equipments, and it's becoming a bit blurred. The Valentine, which I have changed my opinion on. I've decided now it's a good tank, but it's causing a bit of confusion. It's quite well protected, but it's also a bit quick. And so it's starting to mask, well, hold on, is it an infantry tank or is it a cruiser? But it's only got a small gun, so it's not sort of a universal tank. And then comes along the Sherman, which in theory has armour as good as a Matilda II, plus the performance of a top-end cruiser. And a lot of people are fans of Sherman, and there's a lot to like about them, quantity, ease of use, and so on. And so this questions start to be asked, why can't we use the Sherman to use both? The Armour Corps itself has started to look at this, and back in 42, it acknowledges that there could be a blurring of the edges, and that the concept of the heavy, slow, powerful infantry or assault tank, as it calls it, has definitely receded. The other man who was very much against them was Monty. In 43, he wrote to CIGS after about 5 months in command of the 8th Army and said that he wasn't into this split. He wanted one class of tank to do both these mobile manoeuvre operations and the support of dismounted infantry. And he wanted a cruiser to do it, and particularly Shermans. He attempted to exclude Churchill's, which was now the in-service infantry tank, from his assault on the Mareth line in March 43. He didn't want to take Churchill's to Sicily. And he tried to get rid of them didn't want to use them in Northern Europe. But thankfully, they did go to Sicily, where the Canadians used them to good effect, and they were used in Italy and in Northwest Europe. So some quite powerful people are not in favour of infantry tanks. Let's push forward to 44 and the invasion of France. And again, it's just probably worth recapping what the Armoured Corps consists of this stage. We've now got 5 armoured divisions in the British Army, 4 independent armoured brigades, equipped with Shermans predominantly. We've got 8 armoured brigades from Canada, Poland, New Zealand, and South Africa. The Army has got 15 infantry divisions, and it's got 6 tank brigades. And that works out at about just gusting 4,000 cruiser tanks and under 1,000 infantry tanks. So you've got a mismatch there, and therefore infantry tanks are scarcer, which might lead you to use a Sherman for an infantry tank task. And that's exactly what happened soon after D-Day. And I'm going to concentrate on an area just down here, village of Christop, down near Tilly, to the west and southwest of Caen, and I'm going to look at the 4th, 7th Royal Dragoon Guards. Successful landing with their Shermans. But according to their regimental history, they soon realised that their guns were outmatched by enemy tanks and by anti-tank guns, and that in a straight fight, at anything over point-blank range, they were backing a loser every time. They went on to say that the armour of the Shermans rarely resisted any armour-piercing shot, except at extreme range. And the action I want to describe is at Christo, on the 11th of June. The aim was to secure high ground beyond the village, but to get to that high ground, they had to clear the village. To clear the village, they decided they were going to take tanks and infantry in to a well-defended village. As the 4th, 7th readily admit, this is the first time they'd made an attack with infantry in close support of infantry and infantry in close support. And the Shermans were destroyed. B Squad and 4th, 7th ceased to exist at the end of the day. It went in ahead of the infantry. It didn't have that support, and it got shot up by the Germans. And so by the time the infantry got to the objective, they were also shot up, and they suffered significant casualties because they didn't have any armour support. It was essentially the same as what happened at Hellfire Pass in Vignette 3. And it failed for many of the same reasons, in that there wasn't the artillery support and the infantry were too far away from the tanks they were meant to be supporting. The additional problem is that the Sherman isn't as well defended or well protected as a Matilda was. Well, similar. And so you end up with a similar result. So this close quarter fighting continues. We end up with Epsom, and then we end up with a number of other operations. And actually, Epsom, we end up with Churchill's leading, because we're learning that going toe-to-toe with the Germans in a Sherman pardon the rhymes there, it is not a good thing to do. I'm not suggesting that the Churchill was the perfect tank for all the conditions they faced in and met in Normandy. It was a bit slow to exploit, although I'm going to come back to that very shortly. But when it came to this, I say, going toe-to-toe with a dug-in enemy, it was the right weapon to be using. And even in 44, it was. Just a couple of weeks after that incident at Cristo, Monty wrote to the War Office stating, and I'm going to quote this, he considered that there should be, in future, no differentiation between cruiser and infantry tanks, and that all infantry, all armoured formations should be equipped with the same tank. Just weeks after what just a couple of weeks after what he'd seen at Cristo, he complained in October 44 that the Churchill's lack of speed and poor gun rendered it unsuitable for his use. He used the term a capital tank, his term for a dual purpose tank. He wanted the Sherman to do it. And he wrote again in more definitive terms in February 45 that he wanted a universal tank, which is strange because he must have seen what was happening in front of him, both in North Africa and in Northwest Europe. He did make some claims against the Churchills that were true, but they also applied to the cruiser fleet. He was very rude about the Churchill's 75mm gun. Oh, the same gun that was mounted on a Cromwell, which he described back in July 44 as being suitable. And he must have been aware of the differing levels of survivability. In fact, he must have done, yeah, because everybody else knew it, but he was still championing the cause of a universal tank. Okay, I've said one of the things that perhaps the infantry tanks couldn't do was exploitation because they're a bit slow. I'm now going to try and disprove that and look at this in the opposite direction of using an infantry tank for a cruiser role. And we're across the Rhine. It's March 45, and we need to get to Munster. And it's 6 Guards Tank Brigade. They're probably called 6 Guards Armoured Brigade by now, but they're still in Churchill's. And they were told to get there as quick as possible. And they did. And they got the final 40 miles done, opposed, this was, in just over 5 hours. And I reckon that actually a Cromwell regiment would struggle to do that. And yeah, that's a cherry-picked example, a lone example. But I think it does go to prove the point. 1946, end of the war, policy goes, and we're into the universal tank. So to conclude, was it a valid concept in the context? Well, yes, I think it was. In technological terms, there was very little choice, and we couldn't have a well-protected, well-armoured tank that could also do shock action. It was a sound, technical, tactical, doctrinal solution that was taken, and I think examples I've given have shown that if you try and use a cruiser for an infantry tank role, you will suffer. Don't take a knife to a gunfight. There were critics of the policy. Monty, he was very vocal. Thankfully, not too many people listened to him all of the time, and the infantry tank continued its fight to the end of the war. So I would say that taken in the context described and analysed in this paper, the context of the infantry tank was sensible, correct, well judged, and therefore valid. Thank you very much.
Very much indeed. That was fascinating. If I can invite you, please, to turn your camera and mic off, and invite Philip to turn his mic and camera on, and we will now progress to Philip Brazier's presentation. Philip is also a historian practitioner, because by profession a teacher, but by vocation and inclination
by choice,
a warrant officer class 2, a squadron sergeant major in the Army Reserves, and his presentation is British and Canadian combat engineers during operations to clear the Scheldt estuary, 1944. Philip, up to you.
Thank you very much. Just waiting to see when my slides come up. There we go. Just move back. Okay, yeah. So as I've said, this is me, and the picture itself paints 1,000 words. Some of the Netherlands contingent who are watching this may be able to tell us where this is, but they'll come on to that later. So the format, we're looking at the Scheldt campaign, which is broken down into a number of different operations, but then we need to go back and look at the operations in Dieppe, which is all comes in as part of the armoured engineer concept. And then at the end, look at reconstruction post-conflict. For those that don't know where the Scheldt estuary is, the red pin in the top picture shows you, and then the detail is on the map there. The estuary is in Belgian Dutch territory, and from the North Sea to Antwerp, it's 40 to 60 miles, depending on how straight your crow is flying. The British Army went to Walcheren in 1809. On the image here, you can see it's connected to Beaverland. This is because of reclamation, as they say. God may have made the world, but the Dutch made the Netherlands. So yeah, the landscape has changed since. The British Army went there in 1809, as Walcheren is the key to the Scheldt, and if you control Walcheren, you control what comes in and out. In late 44, British forces returned there as part of the Anglo-Canadian 21st Army Group under Montgomery. And what I'd like to just say, I think you'll hopefully find there's a number of webs that weave us our way between my talk and Gareth's talk, which is that you'd almost think this was planned. So yeah, we're moving on. So several sources tell us the worth of 79th Armoured Division and its engineered tanks on D-Day. Here you see Avery 1 Charlie and its 40-pound petard gun at Juno Beach, and this is part of a standard Normandy tour. It reinforces what we've heard before, but my question when I looked at this was, did the criteria, did the success apply in the Scheldt campaign? Before going to the Scheldt, it's important to go back and look at Dieppe in 42. So for Op Jubilee, 9 Field Company Royal Canadian Engineers were tasked with getting the tanks over the Churt Beach using lengths of chestnut fencing, which you can see in the bottom picture there, negotiate the sea wall by building timber ramps and destroying obstacles blocking road access into the town. They had no training manual for this, and they were not given access to instructions when they were sent up to Ripon to train. The defences remained in situ, and the wire remained uncut, as you can see in the top picture. There was a 90% casualty rate amongst the Canadian sappers. Post-action reports recommended an increased allocation of wire cutters and shorter lengths of Bangalore torpedoes. But what was found to be actually required was a system of systems of tools, protection and fire support. Which brings us to the Zoo of Hobart's Funnies, Hobart having been mentioned by Gareth. Now, this has been cited, the term Zoo of Hobart's Funnies has been cited by some as an indication of flippancy by British High Command. However, it was effective. It utilised a level of specialist planning and engineering beyond that of German capability in 1944. Note the evolution of the chest paling design. You haven't got sappers pulling out sections of fence. You've got the Avery rolling its own mat. Then you've got the crab or the flail beating the ground rather than having sappers on their belt buckles prodding for mines. And then if you come across an anti-tank ditch, the Avery can drop the fascine in. But as you can see there, before it gets there, the commander has to sit up on top and give directions to the driver. What is important to remember is how this all fitted in with what's been termed recently as Montgomery's functional doctrine of a master plan, concentration of force, firepower-based attrition, and caution. It has been asked, does this reinforce the perceptions that German soldiers were the best, that the German soldier was worth 1.2 British, American, or Canadian soldiers? Well, come on, hopefully that will be explained by the end of this. So here you see the AO around Antwerp. The Scheldt flows from the North Sea past Breskens, which you can see in the top of the bottom red rectangle, and then Flushing, or Antwerp as it was called then, Flushing or Vlissingen as it's called now, onto Antwerp. Now Antwerp, as I'm sure many of you will know, was captured early in September 44 intact. Resources were then diverted to Market Garden, but operating a port of this size would save having a logistics trail going all the way back to the Mulberry Harbour in Normandy and the beaches there too. Winter was coming, the Allies needed a port, a large one preferably, but unfortunately the Belgian Dutch territory had not been cleared, so this I would say is akin to capturing the old port of London but not clearing the Kent and Essex coast. The operations to do this, first in the bottom red rectangle you have Operation Switchback, to clear the Breskens pocket, which is outlined by the Leopold Canal. Cross that canal and also the Brachman Inlet, to then be able to clear the port of Breskens and the guns that are there as well, and which will enable you to attack Walcheren. Vitality 1 launches north from Antwerp to clear the South Beaverland Peninsula. You see that in the uppermost red rectangle. And Vitality 2 links up with that by crossing the Scheldt and outflanking German defences to the west of the South Beaverland Ship Canal. In the Infatuate operations, in the blue rectangle, Infatuate 1 go into Flushing, Vlissingen, and Infatuate 2 assault the naval guns at West Capella once the sea dikes had been breached by Bomber Command to flood the island and isolate them in their bunkers. Now, there was no special command structure for certainly the Infatuate operations. It was supposedly all within 21st Army Group, but headquarters in Montgomery showed little interest for it. The responsibility was devolved to 1st Canadian Army, whose commander did take an interest, but then handed most of the work on to 2nd Canadian Corps. Firm decisions were unfortunately not made about the chain of command until about 5 weeks before the operation, and not helped by the headquarters for the different components being in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and back in the UK. Meanwhile, as my topics about the sappers, they were training, and during training they were encouraged to learn drills from the PAM, the pamphlet, training pamphlet, but see it as an incentive to thought rather than a textbook. And all ranks could put forward ideas to improve things rather than it all being entirely top down. This would help maintain Montgomery's initiative within the initiative, and that's great. But here you see doctrine, again, going back to what Gareth was saying earlier on. Hobart was keen that the Avery or the flail was not seen as a jack of all trades, while the Armoured Corps wanted 79th Armoured Division to maintain its gunnery skills for tank versus tank action. And there is a lot of focus on the armoured engineers, but you need to remember there was still a role for standard field companies. Yes, you could ask the infantry for assistance to dig for mines, but reports from Normandy indicated they were very reluctant to do so, especially if they'd just seen a flail operating in the local area. Sapper support is also relevant here, as during meetings in early October, the commanding officers of 4-7 and 4-8 Commando and 4 Special Service Brigade demanded armour and sapper support to avoid a repeat of Dieppe. Another piece of kit which is relevant to this campaign is the landing vehicle track, the LVT. This was first used on Guadalcanal in 42. 200 were delivered to the UK in late 43. And it's important here to see the detail on the tracks and the steering. The slanted oblong sections at the rear enable the driver to steer by channeling the energy churned up through the paddle tracks. But the thing is here that between operations, these beasts have to be moved on low loaders, otherwise the scoop paddle tracks will be worn down on the roads, and if that happens then they won't be effective in the water. So that's a logistics consideration for you. On its plus side, the LVT had a radial engine and therefore no radiator that needed filling, and that's important on an island, Walcheren, flooded with seawater. And you can find it in the notes in the archives where the commanders have written in, this thing does not need X amount of water per day. It's brilliant. It has a radial engine. So moving on now to Switchback. The Canadians have been in the field since Normandy, and their training for Switchback was on the job. The sappers became subject matter experts to train the infantry in mine detection, clearance and diffusing of IEDs and mines and booby traps. And here the cascading of training worked well, possibly because it was practical rather than a snowstorm of paperwork. In order to keep up with the armour, 8 Field Company RCE improvised a prefab bridge, or obtained trailers from Antwerp to make it transportable and mobile, and they also borrowed half tracks to enable field companies to move up and support tanks. They conducted exercise hotshot, which you can see in one of the lower pictures there, with Wasp flamethrowers, and experimented with bulldozers to pull artillery out of the mud and also dig them into embankments, which were generally the only firm ground around. Much of the rest of the ground had been flooded, restricting mobility, which provided very good fields of fire, again, which you can see in the lower photograph there. Canadian commanders were wholeheartedly committed to 21st Army Group, even if it meant attempting the impossible. Post-operation reports by 3rd Canadian Division said that armour was invaluable against German positions, but the narrow roads and mud meant they could only be used in penny packets. The roads and the dikes were also generally mined. The flails were not effective on the pave roads, and they were also awkward on the other poor roads in the area, and they could become a roadblock if damaged. Therefore, it fell back on the field companies to clear the roads by hand. In this, the Polish mine detector, which you can see here, was found to be more effective, and what they were looking for is the wooden shoe mine or toe popper, the bounding S mine, or the glass mine 43, which is a Pyrex mine. That was hard to detect even for the Polish mine detector. Bridging was problematic. Most existing crossing sites have been destroyed and sown with mines. The soft ground made constructing bridges, and I quote, an engineer nightmare. The Avery could carry a small box girder bridge, but it experienced the same problems as for the flail. Again, much use was made of bulldozers to open up routes over dikes by lessening the gradients for the vehicles. Excuse me. For wet crossings, FBE was an alternative. It was light, man-portable across ground that vehicles would sink into. However, it was proved in these operations to be obsolete in combat, wasn't durable, and couldn't carry heavy equipment or armour. While the sappers could carry small assault bridges to site, the bridges couldn't carry a lot of stores. Bailey also couldn't be constructed close to the front with acceptable losses on the bridgehead. Infantry also complained that the sapper and pioneer units often didn't deliver collapsible boats to rendezvous on time. So, despite having the machinery, it didn't greatly tip the balance in favour of the Allies in the performance of close support tasks in these operations. The campaign also saw the last use of the Conga device, mounted on a Bren gun carrier, which you can see there, and towed behind an Avery. A converted fire hose would be launched into a minefield, pumped full of nitroglycerine, and then detonated, and similar to those who remember it from the Cold War era of Giant Viper or Python. Unfortunately, on the 20th of October in the harbour area of 284 Field Squadron 6 Assault Regiment, Royal Engineers, there was an explosion which killed 41, of whom 16 were never found, and wounding 43. The court of inquiry was held, but no report was published. And the details of it were not kept in the unit war diaries, and several people, including the great Richard Holmes and the definitely not so great me, have tried to find it, but to no avail. And if anybody does find it, please share. The Vitality operations, as you see in the top map there, push along the Beaverland Peninsula, supported by landings on the Scheldt to outflank the enemy. 6th Canadian Division advanced into the area in late October, but here too the crossing of the South Beaverland Ship Canal was delayed due to the slow pace at which boats could be brought up. It's recorded that the commitments required of sappers in the AO were much more than under the terrain and route conditions considered normal since Normandy. This put extra responsibility onto the pioneer platoons in infantry battalions to clear mines, IEDs, and open transport for F echelons to come into battle. They needed, the pioneers, further and continuous training. While infantry could cross fire-swept ground, the doctrine of heavy fire and armour meant the need for increased engineering assets. The CRE of 2nd Army made it clear that this vital task hadn't been given the priority it deserved, leaving field companies to do the best they could. The CRE of 1st Army wanted future sappers to be more road conscious, aware of the need to keep routes open. His final point that was infantry would have to work on the principle there would be never sufficient sappers and equipment to go round, especially on wide and divergent frontages. In Vitality 2, 156 and 157 brigades of 52nd Lowland Division were put across the Scheldt in LVTs. This required sapper support to get them up the canal to Tenoisen on the south bank of the Scheldt, building of ramps and bulldozing the banks to enable them to get the grip. This shot here is from Switchback, with LVTs entering the water to land at the Hoofdplaat. The LVTs again needed 2 Canadian field companies to constantly maintain and repair the ramps out of the waterways. They couldn't operate on their own. Now the Infatuate operations, again clearing the key to the Scheldt, Vulcan Island. First off, the landings at Flushing. What stopped this being a repeat of Dieppe was the use of artillery from south of the Scheldt and landing in darkness. Infantry landed, got their way through the mud. As you can see there, the LVT helped with that. Passed through the beach defences and made their way into the town. And sappers here were used to mouse hole their way through buildings. For Infatuate 2 at West Capella, from October, Bomber Command had targeted 4 points on the island to sink it and isolate the German concrete bunkers. Unfortunately, the warning leaflets dropped, were vague, and many civilians were killed. This is the effect of 1,200 tons of high explosive at West Capella. The gap, you can see, had 6 knots flying through it at low tide. At high tide, it was a 300-foot wide gap that was impassable. Infatuate 2 on the 1st of November. Support was from Typhoons and the monitors Warspite, Roberts and Erebus and their 15-inch guns. North of the gap, there were no DD tanks available to cover the landings. The Staffordshire Yeomanry had lost one in training. Flails and Averies therefore landed directly onto the beach, while Navy and converted landing craft engaged the shore defences. And here you see a flail of the Lothian and Border Horse trying to make its way through the undiscovered clay, because unfortunately there'd been no time for a recce to the level of those you find that are spoken about before D-Day. Bombing had removed the stone covering of the sea dike, causing the Great Sapper tragedy, with several vehicles drowned despite the efforts of their crews to save them. And there was meant to be 4 armoured engineer teams on the beach in the plan. We'll come on to how many were left. Here you see White Beach to the south of the gap. Dozers were used to extract the vehicles, but some of these too were lost. LVTs, fortunately for them, could swim their way ashore. As the tide went out, exposing more mud, there was increased difficulty getting equipment ashore. The Weasel, which is the small vehicle at the water's edge, was found to be underpowered. And again, for the plan, this didn't help because they carried many of the radios for the forward reservers. By the end of the day, what was left were 2 Sherman command tanks, 2 flails, 2 Avery, and a bulldozer. The flails, unfortunately, then drowned when the tide came in. And as you can see, the landing was effectively cut in 2. While south of the gap, artillery fire could be called upon. The only artillery powerful enough to support the Marines north of the gap were 155mm pieces to the south of the Scheldt, and they required a safety margin officially of 1,000 yards. There was also problems with air and naval support due to bad weather, lack of radios, and mortar fire on the radio teams. The LCT support squadron lost 6 ships beaching within 100 yards of the bunkers, taking on 105 and 155 naval guns in concrete with, as you can see there, 17-pounder anti-tank guns in turrets. The bunkers could be taken out by Typhoons. The petard on the Avery was found to be not strong enough. And German POWs stated they were prepared to stand behind their machine guns, not in front of them, behind their machine guns while they only had Marines in front of them. Armour made a difference, whether it be an LVT, a Crab, or an Avery. The CRE of divisional troops stated that practically nothing went as arranged from a sapper point of view. But luckily, the probability of this had been impressed on all of those in training beforehand, and they were flexible enough to enable the Marines to take their objectives, which reflected well on their efforts. Such flexibility of thought is often only attributed to German forces. By the end of the fighting, what was left were 2 Sherman command tanks and a bulldozer. That was all that was left in action. Post-action reports emphasised the number of rounds fired by flails and Averies, and this is different to what you find about for Normandy. And in the books published post-war, they featured many of the letters of appreciation. They featured prominently in the write-up about it. And my question here is, had 79th Armoured Division become the jack of all trades that Hobart didn't want? And if so, why did he agree to this? Moving on. So you see a bulldozer constructing the beach maintenance area and keeping the lines of communication open. Here, working with the ruins of West Capella in the background. They were meant to start with 10 bulldozers, but they were soon, as you can see, down to 1. What is not reported is this was often only possible due to sappers hand clearing the mines from the shifting sands of the dunes. Which brings us now to Operation Mallard. So after all the other operations, you're now left to advance across the Slowdown Causeway and join up with the forces advancing from Flushing and from West Capella. And when you do that, you can then seize the German command positions at headquarters at Middleburg. Here we see the importance of recce. At West Capella, the sapper teams had not been able to get close enough to the defences to record the damage to the sea dike and find the mud that swallowed the armoured teams. For the crossing of the Slow Channel, intelligence reports stated it was 14 feet deep and issued maps indicated navigable water. Therefore, the plan had been to paddle the channel. This was not possible, but what the commanders have got to remember to do is they have to maintain the initiative, keep the enemy off balance, and fight according to the plan. The Canadian infantry were therefore detailed to assault along the causeway, which was 40 metres wide and 1,600 metres long, and has been described by writers since as a perfectly engineered killing ground. They reached the other side, but they could make no significant bridgehead, and they were withdrawn, replaced by 156 Infantry Battalion of 52nd Lowland Division. The commander requested a halt for at least 24 hours, and a recce by Lieutenant Turner and Sergeant Humphrey from 241 field company over the mudflats found a relatively dry route. They take this, and by using wading and paddling a short distance, were able to outflank the defensives and put 2 battalions across by this route, and then supplied at high tide by units using the folding boats. So having moved on from these positions, all that remained to do was to head towards Middelburg, the headquarters of the German defences. Here, the LVTs were a prime piece of kit. They were used to intimidate the German general to surrender. They were big, they were noisy, they were tank-ish, and they were ideal for negotiating the ground. But then we have to consider the aftermath. Congratulations, you have been liberated, but how do you support this devastated and flooded community? After liberation, the field companies were involved with improving roads, docks, canals, and clearing mines. And this went on for several months. The LVTs and amphibians were found to be essential for mobility, but they were often heavily loaded, and high losses, as you can see here, could be taken if they hit mines. The incident at Ceres Kirke bringing that out. Flooding meant that sanitation became a major problem, and there was the very severe prospect of a typhoid outbreak. The tanks lost at West Capella remained there until the post-war scrap drive. The Mulberry was towed into place, or sections of it were towed into place from Arromanches to assist with filling the gaps blown by Bomber Command. And again, this is where liaison and reconstruction comes in. The Dutch had a traditional method of doing this, which was very effective, but the resources and time were against them. So an idea was put forward by the SAHR liaison officers to try this. There were several heated discussions and a need to prove the concept. A similar situation happened with fixing the docks in Flushing, but again, they were able to find ways and means of doing so. So in summary, there are many similarities with more recent operations carried out by the British and I dare say Canadian Army too. Very relevant for training and the ability of junior NCOs to solve problems in an AO where the ground does not assist your preferred doctrine. And as I've pointed out in the last couple of slides there, definitely the value of reconstruction and liaising with local forces wherever possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I could now invite you to turn your mic and camera back on. We'll head for the Q&A. We are running a little bit long, I've noted, but and there are quite a few questions, which I'll try and condense because there's a bit of overlap. I must explain to people that I will read out the questions because for the benefit of recording, the questions have to be read out so that they will feature for those who couldn't attend and can see the recording later. Yes, there's quite a lot of questions. A couple of might have an overlap. But the first one, Gareth, is for you. It's asked by Paul, did any other nations follow the infantry support / exploitation tank type model? If so, when and why? And were they copying the British?
Yes, some did. The French had a similar route, and so did the Russians. Were the French copying the British? No, but informed by them. If you think about the French in the First World War, they had their Chaumont, and they had heavy tanks, and then they had the FT, that lovely little light tank, and they sort of developed from there, and they end up with the heavy infantry tank, support tank in 1939, 1940, which actually does a pretty good job. The Russians do have some slow, heavy tanks. I'm not talking about the JS. I'm talking about earlier on in the 30s. What is interesting is I think they have come to that their own way. I don't think they're following the British way. What's interesting is the Germans don't go for an infantry tank. Now, that may have been because of Versailles and the way in which they went about developing their tank fleet. They focused on the Panzer 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s. But they did essentially bring back in that infantry support vehicle as the assault gun. In a way, you could argue that's a more pure version of an infantry tank because it's got a larger gun in a number of cases. You can fire an HE round. So yes, Other nations did, France and Russia in particular, not the Germans, not really the Americans. Were they copying? Influenced by.
Thank you. Philip, one for you.
Yep.
Forgive me, I've lost it. Yes, this is from Robin. He said, can you please enlarge on Hobart's jack of all trades fear, please?
Yes, so it's Hobart wanted all the engineer assets to remain under engineer control. They were scared of what had been seen in the desert, in the engineer, even unarmored engineers. If a unit could get hold of them, no matter how many, or sorry, how few, infantry and armored units tended not to want to let them go back. So once they had engineers, they would always try to be squirreled away or lost. Have you seen? No, definitely haven't seen them recently. And he was concerned that they would then. He was worried that valuable engineers would be lost in tank attacks. The flail skills, and I know the yeomanry people here would say brilliant that we were doing an excellent job as flail crews, but they didn't want them to then be lost in a tank versus tank action. Their job was there to clear the route for the armor, be it cruiser or infantry, to go to exploit the G and gap. So yeah, that was his fear, and he was forever arguing that my armored engineers will stay within the core and be loaned out when necessary, and we will get them back very quickly, and they are not to be used in tank versus tank action.
Thank you. Just having a scroll through. There are some questions which will overlap you both, but I'll get onto that. Gareth, a question from Pete. It says, apologies if I missed it, but exactly what was Monty's reason or reasons for wanting to use a single tank type? Logistical, simplification of organization? Question mark?
He never clearly states one simple reason. It's all of those. I think he's less interested in the logistical side. I don't think he's particularly bothered about the supply issue, although he understands the challenges of it. There are within the Sherman fleets or the Churchill fleets enough differences for there to be too many spare parts than really would be sensible. No, he wants one tank. So when it comes to doing something with tanks, it's tanks. Get on and do that. It's a bit like the formation of the Royal Logistic Corps, isn't it? When the RLC formed, you didn't know if you had a driver, a storeman, a chef, a postie, or a pioneer. And you had to work out which one was which before you could get them to do a task. With a tank, you had to sort of think, oh, no, I don't want that tank, I want that tank. He just wanted one. And I think his desire has been proved right with, well, is it the Centurion or is it something else? But we end up with main battle tanks, which do all those tasks. They exploit because they can move fast, but they can also go toe-to-toe with an enemy. So he wasn't wrong. He was just wrong at that time.
Thank you. There are two questions that overlap, so I will put them one up, but if the questioners will forgive me exercising chairman's right. I'm just trying to find it. Yes, this question is asked by Mark, also by Paul. I think you can both answer this one. Gareth asks, how do you think the crocodile should have been exploited more in Northwest Europe?
Well, I might cheat and say, well, crocodile, of course, isn't an infantry tank brigade asset. It is absolutely one of Hobo's assault engineer assets, and therefore it's exactly what Philip was talking about. Should it have been more? How do I think it should have been more exploited? Have been exploited more? I have never considered how it should have been exploited more. And there's a premise there: should it have been exploited more? I think there's a lot of myth associated with crocodiles. I think they are worthy of a study in their own right. I don't know the answer because I've never thought about it. And so, at the risk of doing a bit of a hospital pass, over to you, Philip.
Yes, I know that it's said that often all you had to, the cliche is you put a couple of squirts either side of a position, and certainly towards the end of the war, the defenders might be more likely to surrender. Whether burning people is particularly what you want to be doing all the time. And I know we then get into, well, why did the Americans use flamethrowers so much in the Pacific? It's very pertinent that flamethrowers aren't allowed to be used anymore. I would say it's something that was possibly needed to be done at the time, but I think both sides then took a very long breath and thought, yeah, maybe this is not the way forward. And I'm pretty sure it's under the Geneva Convention and we're not allowed to use them anymore. So it's, yeah, I would be thinking quite carefully about the psychology of someone who says, let's just burn the whole place down. I know they had to use them at Bells to help cope with the typhoid outbreak or what they got there. But yeah, I really don't think we should be burning our way forward.
Thank you. Gareth, a question from Ewan. Do you have a view on the numbers of tank variants and spares parts, not tanks, that is?
I do have a view. Yes, lots, and it would have been a nightmare. And can I go to the worst possible case and then dial back from that? The worst possible case would have been in Italy, where we end up taking regiments like 46 RTR, 50, 51 RTR, and they are in theory tank regiments with Churchills, but it's not just one form of Churchill. They've got at least three variants. They've got the North Africa 75, which has got a Sherman gun put onto it. They've got their own 75s and another version of Churchills, but they also end up with 3 troops of Churchills and 2 of Shermans, or maybe it's the other way around, per squadron. Oh, and of course they've got some light tanks and some armoured cars and everything else. So yes, far too many types, and yes, it probably was an element of that. I like contradict what I said earlier. In Monty's mind, narrowing it down would have been easier, but we don't help ourselves with the 2-pounder, and we get stuck with that early on before the war, and I blame Hobart for that. I can really go against Hobo and the 2-pounder and his non-combined arms armoured division. So those are 2 things I think were poor decisions. So to answer the chairman's question, I do have a view. It must have been an absolute nightmare for a QM tech, and that's my answer.
Thank you. One for you, Philip. Again from Paul. Was crewing the LVTs always an armoured responsibility, or were sappers employed as well?
Yeah, so you have a mixture of tank corps and armoured engineer squadrons. I think I've got 8.2 and 7.7 are numbers that spring to mind, and I know there is at least one book I've seen that was privately published by could be somebody from 141 Tank Regiment, I think. The love was shared, and between the two, but they were still all part of 79th Armoured Division.
Yeah.
There's a sort of parallel question to that from Nicholas. By 1945, were armoured commanders interchangeable between the infantry support / exploitation roles, or was it still a cavalry RTR split?
That's a good question. Most of the brigade commanders of the tank brigades, a tank brigade didn't operate as a brigade. As it farmed out its battalions and regiments to infantry divisions, and so it wasn't quite the right lads follow me brigade command role that Michael Carver, later Field Marshal Carver, would have been doing when he was commanding 4th Armoured Brigade. So some of them, yes, would have been able to, and some end up trying to do both. It really would have boiled down to individuals. It's a question that can't be generalised. It would be based on individuals.
Okay, thank you. Let's have a look, see what... yes, this is from Robin. Gareth, did the split concept work as well in the Far East? It seems Slim was keen on tanks for bunker busting.
Okay, this is really easy to answer. Not a clue. Never studied the Far East phenomenon. And
Fair enough.
I have absolutely no idea, I'm afraid.
I do recall that rather bizarre Australian invention, a rocket launcher on the back of a Matilda. But yeah, that's.
I have. It's one of the few rabbit holes I have avoided going down, being the Far. I apologise to all those who served in the Far East for calling it a rabbit hole, but I think you know what I mean.
Apparently, Captain Sir Tom mentions it in his book, and I was told by a colleague that one of his lines is Burma was not good tank country. So it was where they could be used. I'm sure they were valuable. I'm sure it would have been quite difficult country.
Yes, read the works of Brian Perrett.
Yes.
Yeah. A question from Peter. Philip, this is for you. For the attack on the Walcheren causeway, can you speak about the integration of engineers with the Canadian infantry for the night assault?
Well, on this, I would be really glad to find out more. I've done some digging and not found much at all. It's mostly found in the 52nd Lowland archive, and in the books written by Canadian authors, I haven't found. Again, if I'd found it, I would have put up more. So if anybody has got more information out there, I would love to have it. Please contact me and send me the pages. I'd love to read them.
Fair enough. And as time is getting long, again, apologies, ladies and gentlemen, if your specific question wasn't asked. This is an interesting question from Neil. Gareth, does Gareth think that the most successful post-war universal tank, the Centurion, owed more to the Churchill than the cruisers? Improved durability for less range and speed?
No, I don't. I think in design terms and in terms of interchangeable parts, so suspension, road wheels, track, engines, bits of the gearbox, I think even final drives, I think there's a very obvious line from Cromwell to Comet to Centurion, which instantly then goes on to Chieftain to Challenger to Challenger 2. If you look at the road wheels on a Challenger 2, they're pretty blimmin' similar to the road wheels on a Cromwell, and probably made by the same people. So I get the point. I mean, it is a good question. No, because the requirement was different. The development of the Churchill, of course, was the Black Prince, which was not it. Well, to me, it's my favourite tank of all time because it's just awesome. But it's not. It's a bit rubbish because they made it bigger and heavier with more punch, but they didn't give it any more power. So actually, it doesn't really achieve a huge much more than a Churchill. And so I think no. I think the Centurion, the lineage is there both technically and I think perhaps serendipitously on the doctrinal side.
Thank you very much. Now, I know time is pressing, but by means of a vignette about the Centurion, when I was a callow young trooper in a yeomanry regiment, our regimental sergeant major was an extremely bluff and gruff Yorkshireman from the 13th, 18th Hussars, who we all walked in trembling terror of course. But one day we were out on ranges and there was a Centurion Hulk in pretty much good condition. And he immediately looked like a 6-year-old in a toy shop, went sprinting over to it, leapt on it, and spent 3/4 of an hour demonstrating to us how a Centurion worked, operated, and fought. Brilliant. He was as happy as happy. I think that all that leaves me to do is to thank you both very much for 2 excellent papers, to thank everybody for tuning in and listening. I apologize for going a bit long or if being unable to answer your questions. We got through as many as possible. And I hope very much that you've enjoyed the evening. And thank you very much for attending and for your interest. And can I please ask you to show your appreciation for the speakers? Thank you very much.
want to take your cameras off, gents. I let the box go for a little while, but then I'll close the session down. Just a reminder to everybody that the recording will go out automatically tonight, but when you see the recording, you will not see the chat box, unfortunately, nor will you see the questions that were put up on the screen, which is why the chairman read them out. Thank you all, and good night. Hopefully you'll sign up for next week's sessions.
Thank you.